Welcome, and thank you all of you for coming along. I'm the Archivist for the Anglican Church, Diocese of Sydney. There are 23 Anglican dioceses in Australia. Each of them is financially and administratively autonomous. They're like little companies, standalone. These dioceses come together to discuss matters of national policy through the General Synod of the Anglican Church of Australia, and they meet every few years. And so that's where they thrash out the big issues like ordination of women and all the big ticket stuff that you see discussed in the press, and trying to figure out, can we do this for the whole of Australia or not? Because each diocese is rather individual in flavour and in levels of churchmanship, they're very individual in how much money they've got and in how they want to run their own patch. As you can imagine, General Synod is always a rather lively sort of body, because there's a hell of a lot of debate over who wants to do what and how. But one of the hallmarks of the Anglican Church is that it has a notion of breadth of expression. So disagreement and debate is rather good from the Anglican point of view. And although it can cause a bit of grief from time to time, I think most people would rather have it that way, to have the freedom to differ. So, of course, it all started here in Sydney in 1788 with some chaplains coming with the first fleet. Now, I'm not an historian, so if anyone happens to be an expert in great detail with the history and development of the Anglican Church in Australia and I get something terribly wrong, please correct me. But I tend to just have a rather broad overview rather than in detail. But essentially, the COE set up in the new colony was run through the Diocese of London, and they trained up clergy specifically for colonial service, which must have been pretty exciting, I think, to have that vision of, oh, I'm going to be trained up specially to go over to the colonies and do this evangelistic work. So pioneering kind of work, different from just having a parish in England. And then gradually, that was roughly 1787 to 1840, and then through that time here locally we had the chaplains, and they're all names you've heard of: Johnson, Marsden, Cowper, Cartwright and Fulton. From 1825 to 1835, we fell under the jurisdiction of the Diocese of Calcutta, which sounds very exotic and makes you think, well, how did they figure that one out? Was it just everything over there that can go under Calcutta? There still is a Diocese of Calcutta, and someone was asking me the other day, well, where are the records that refer to Australia within that decade period? Are they in the archives of the Diocese of Calcutta? They should be. I don't know if they are. It's a good question. Other than that, because the Anglican Church was a state church, essentially, following the English model, and part of the notions of law and order and religion controlling people and stopping them from being bigamous and not looking after their children and being an uncivilized rabble, whereas if the church could be involved, they would be able to civilise them more and organise them more, and that would be of great benefit to the state. The colonial secretary had an awful lot to do and say with the administration of the church in the colony, and I think the colonial secretary's papers have been well arranged and described and available at State Records New South Wales, so there are probably people who have made their way through the Colsec papers and know a hell of a lot more about it than I do. However, everybody likes to run their own show, administratively and financially. I'll just mention that through that time that we were part of the Diocese of Calcutta, again, a couple more familiar names. Thomas Hobbs Scott was an archdeacon because we became an archdeaconry, which meant we went just up a notch from chaplaincy. And then, of course, William Grant Broughton became an archdeacon in 1829. As I said, the desire for autonomy is always strong, and in 1836 the Diocese of Australia was formally created by letters patent. And you could say that that's when the office opened for business. And of course Broughton became a bishop, the first bishop of Australia. The diocese continued to have a rather rocky relationship with the government, which went along the lines of, we need to expand, give us money. No. We need to expand, give us more money. No. Do the same with less. Now, does that sound slightly familiar? Well, we're doing a lot to help you. with your organisation of people, and there are lots and lots of poor people who need help, so give us more money so that we can expand southwards to Goulburn and up over those mountains and hither and thither. We want buildings, we want clergy, we've got people who need us. Well, tough. And of course there was state aid for churches, and eventually, much later on in the 1880s, it all sort of fell apart. And I think the church was, in a way, rather glad to see the back of the state, because at least finally then they could seriously run their own show. But of course, getting money is always a problem for churches. Now, what you do as soon as you create a Diocese of Australia is you've suddenly got a great big continent and tremendous expansion, very, very quick expansion. And so what you see is that the secular history of the colony, the military history, the governmental history, and the history of the church are moving along a pace, side by side by side, and working in this very cooperative manner to make the society run more smoothly and enable people to be able to get on with their lives in cities, in towns, in suburbs, in farms, the whole thing. You've got these two big, highly structured, highly administrative organisations kind of meshed but not the same, essentially working towards the same goals of expansion. So quite naturally, new dioceses are being created all the time. Sections of this one is hived off, and sections of that is hived off, and it goes on and on. So that New Zealand is hived off in 1841, Tasmania 1842, Sydney becomes standalone in 1847, Newcastle the same year, Adelaide the same year, Melbourne the same year. So you can see they're just going chop, 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 chop. And so from a record-keeping point of view, all these new businesses, as it were, gear up, open up the office, and start business all by themselves. So when we come to be looking at the records and archives, we've got all these administrative cut-off dates, which reflect the fact that all the business went over there. That doesn't mean that records of the day before and preceding are going to go as well. They stay where they are. But anything after that cut-off date shifts along. Then we get Goulburn in 1863, Perth 1857, Brisbane 1859, Armidale and Grafton 1867, Bathurst 79, Ballarat 75, North Queensland 78, Riverina in 1884, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. And I think the most recent one was the Murray in 1970, and St Arnaud merged with Ballarat in 73. So it's very much an ongoing process of administrative dividing. Now, if you think about funding, which is crucial for running any kind of business, 23 dioceses stretched across all of that land in Australia. You can imagine some dioceses even now are really, really strapped for cash, particularly the rural ones. They've got so much land to cover and such particular idiosyncrasies for the geography of a particular area. They're very, very challenged financially. And any organisation that's very challenged financially is usually very uninterested in spending money on record keeping or archives. Until, of course, there's some major legal crisis, in which case they suddenly all turn around and get interested. Sometimes what's not very good for other people is quite good for record keeping. Unfortunately, I would have to say that most of these dioceses do not have a formal diocesan archive. In an ideal world, all 23 of them would, as well as the General Synod, which does have its own archive, an own archivist. It would be lovely for all of them to have that as a part of their head office system, as a part of their diocesan registry, which is the traditional model for Anglican dioceses. I don't know what most of them are doing, really. I guess the records are just either still all out in the parishes. Some of them would be under the responsibility of the registrar. The bigger ones, like Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane and Perth, do have diocesan archives, and most of them are run by professional archivists. But you know, that's a handful. It's very unfortunate, but as I say, record keeping is usually pretty low down on the list of priorities when you're scrabbling around for $1 to be running ministry. So that's just the sort of potted history of the development of the Anglican Church in Australia. If the Diocese of Sydney got going in 1836, you'd think that, well, Again, in an ideal world, you think, well, they might think after about 10 years now, we need to get our record systems going and gradually think forward to having an archive. Well, put it this way, the Diocesan Archives opened in 1977. There was talk about it in the 1950s along the lines of, why don't we have this? But it never really went much further than that. There was, next to St Andrew's Cathedral, a sandstone building called Church House. And some people may remember it. It was knocked down in the 70s when St Andrew's House was built, the office block. And that was head office, essentially, where the Archbishop had his offices, the registrar had his offices. Well, they had a dungeon or a cellar, and they had lots of records down there. There was apparently a rather damp place underneath the cathedral where lots of records were held. There are a number of office blocks around the city, which were either owned or leased by the diocese for various of its entities and agencies such as Senate and these other bodies. And apparently there were records stashed in cellars and underground rooms across the city. This is a normal pattern for many organisations, you know, which is the least valuable bit of real estate in our building, that will be it. Of course, cellars are very prone to damp and water and that kind of thing, so it's not great. So St Andrew's House was built as a result of selling off Glebe. Remember I mentioned the tension between the diocese and the state about money. Well, of course, very early on, those 40 acres in what is the suburb of Glebe were given to the diocese as a glebe, which is a body of land that generates income for a church. And it didn't generate that much income at the beginning, so the government said, well, we'll subsidise you up to £2,000 a year and we'll just take whatever rent we can get from it. But once it goes over $2,000, we'll take the excess. You can imagine that the church wasn't overly impressed by that because, you know, well, the cost of living is increasing and our costs are increasing. I think we'll have that excess. It became problematic. In the 70s, Glebe became a slum. Essentially, by then the diocese was not a good landlord. Well, churches aren't really in the business of being landlords of individual houses for a whole suburb. It's a real estate management business and it's not really the core activity. And they weren't putting a lot of effort into it and it was all costing a lot of money and the buildings were all going to rack and ruin. There are a lot of very poor working class people there. It was splashed across the television and the newspapers. It was a scandal. Something had to be done, so the government bought it back. And I think that's quite funny, seeing as they had to give it away in the first place and then had to buy it back. As a result of buying it back, they built a lot of much newer housing stock for lower income people in Glebe, and you will have seen that it's quite innovative and attractive, actually. And the diocese was able to get out of the business of petty, really, domestic real estate management. Around that time also we had a lot of glebe land all across the diocese which was there to generate income. Service stations and shops and this kind of thing, and a lot of it was liquidated and just sold off. So that you could really just consolidate all the money in stocks and shares or in major properties like city office blocks or something, which is a much more easily manageable piece of real estate. Of course, a church needs an income source, so the Glebe money was put into the Glebe board and the stocks and shares. At that time, St Andrew's House was built. So a couple of levels for the diocese and administration, lease the whole of the rest out. Then you've got an income stream, the building is managed by a corporation. And it gives disbursements to the shareholders, as it were, on an annual basis. There were plans to build a diocesan archive on level 2 of the car park. That didn't happen because, of course, car parks are very expensive real estate. And it did end up being built at level 4 of the car park, which is a much cheaper bit of land. And it was in a room that was sort of higgledy-piggledy like this because it had car park spaces. But it did at least have air conditioning and it was at least reasonably secure. Brick and concrete, which is what you want for an archive. And so Canon Boyce Horsley, who had been rector of Lavender Bay, he became the first archivist. He retired, he was very interested, and he decided that he would take on this role of becoming the diocesan archivist. He went to the University of New South Wales and did the course in archives administration in its first year in 1976. and then took on the job, I think, 3 days a week on an honorarium because, of course, he was on his pension. And he essentially went round Sydney and collected stuff. Wherever it was, he collected it. With the Archbishop's help, he made a number of appeals to the parishes and said, send in your records, all your, your registers, your minute books, your financial records, that kind of thing. So through this period of 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, there was this tremendous influx of records into the Diocesan Archives, which of course is a tremendous amount of work to arrange and describe them and to store them. And so he did his best in what was really, he was just flooded with work, essentially. And then I think he figured he wasn't going to be able to do it indefinitely, and so he convinced the diocese that an archivist should be employed. And Georgina Hart, who'd been the librarian at Shaw School and then went on to become the archivist there, she came and took over the role of diocesan archivist. And this is in the late 1980s. And she was able to get a bit of funding and got some more newly qualified archive students to come and work with her. And they embarked upon the very large job of instituting what is called the Australian series system upon the collection. The Australian series system is an organisational concept based on functional analysis of records, which was invented by Australian archivists and is now about to be debunked by Australian archivists because it doesn't work for digital record keeping. So exciting times for archival theory, but it still works for paper-based records very, very effectively. So it's never going to disappear. It's just when you have new technology, you have to have new theories and practice. But it's a massive job to institute the series system on an existing body of records. They also brought in a portable computer, like this big, and started. The Westpac Archives had written a computer program for archives because there wasn't one anywhere, based on archival theory and principles. And so Georgina and her staff started doing the data entry and getting the description data, the metadata about the collection at a provenance level and a series level, and sometimes an item level onto this database. Tremendous, it's just a huge job, and it will carry on. I could work for the rest of my life and never even scratch the surface. So, after that, the records kept on coming in, because of course it's not just parish records, it's head office records. And this brings me to the answer to the question of what's in there? What is your collection? Essentially, it's the records of a business at work. The Anglican Church, Diocese of Sydney, the records created by its officers in pursuit of its day-to-day business of running the Diocese of Sydney. And if you look at that, what's that going to be mostly? It's going to be minutes, correspondence, financial records, publications. In the parishes, it's going to be registers, minutes, correspondence, financial records, publications. Most archival records are principally minutes, correspondence, financial records and publications. They're records that are produced on this day-to-day basis as a result of the function that you're performing, documenting those activities. And they're so different from other kinds of records, or say library-based records, because no one's thinking about it. It's an immediate experience. It's just life lived. Oh, let's have the meeting. Let's take the minutes. Let's write the correspondence. Oh, we better submit the financial statements. It's just people getting on with the business of doing what they have to do on a day-to-day business, and you've done those minutes, done. Next job, next letter, next business meeting, next service, next baptism, next funeral, just getting on doing the business. And behind you, kind of trailing behind you, creating this body of records that eventually will end up in the archive and will eventually be this record of lives lived, of businesses run, of experiences had. And I think what makes that so interesting is the fact that people weren't thinking about it as they were doing it, they were just living. So you're almost getting this voice from the past, this sort of very contemporary experience when you read archival material, because you're not reading someone's recreation of what they thought it was like in 1840. You're actually reading how they wrote, how they thought, how they managed, how they administrated, how they dealt with other people, and sometimes it's very formal, and every now and then you get these more informal comments, these more in confidence documents, these advices given to the Archbishop about how to deal with this troublesome clergyman, that kind of thing. So you're getting all these different voices coming through the records. Formal voices, semi-formal voices, informal voices. You're seeing, as if you were watching a movie, as you turn the pages of a correspondence file, you're actually seeing the story almost in stop motion. Say you had a file about we need to build a new vestry on the church, and it's all back and forth with builders and architects and banks and funding and councils and this kind of thing. As I say, each time you turn over the page, you get the next little bit of the story. So it's never that kind of beautifully packaged story that a history written by a professional historian will be. It's this sort of bitsy kind of version of history where some little element of it might be missing. That's real life. And I think this is why archivists just love being archivists, really, because we have the privilege of managing collections of the evidence of lives lived. The other thing that's very interesting about records once they become archives is that, of course, the perspective of the user becomes far more diverse. You're sitting there in head office at St Andrew's House and you're running your bit of diocesan business, and you're in charge of managing this thing, and there are the minutes and the financial records and the correspondence, and you've got your filing cabinet and the secretary, and it's all just going on. You're only thinking about today and tomorrow and maybe your 3-month budget and that kind of thing. And can I meet my next goal? What's my next deadline? Good, got that done next. When I speak to the secretaries and the PAs at St Andrew's House, they've got this perspective. They're really not thinking much more than 3 months. The Archbishop's secretary, she thinks 6 months, a year, 2 years, because he's so busy, he's booked out for a long time. The bishops less so, you know, not quite as busy in terms of their diaries. And then the other administrative departments not as booked out. So everyone's really thinking quite short term. And when you say to them, but let's think about how someone else might look at that file of the correspondence, about what's in it, they kind of look at you blankly and they go, well, it's just that. Because they're having to work in this kind of tunnel vision way. And all of us do that. We're just doing the job we have to do. We haven't got time to be looking around. But the researcher has time to look around. So once the record, say, is created and it's this little narrow record that's just going along a track, but it finishes being current and it goes into its semi-current stage, and then it finishes being semi-current and the administrators go, I don't think we're going to need to refer to that anymore to support day-to-day business. That file can now go to the archives. And so it comes to archives, and the day comes when that particular topic is something that someone wants to write the PhD on. And suddenly that file, the pieces of paper in it just spring up to life again. and it's almost as if they twirl around like this. And this new person comes, and what they see in that document or that volume is so different from what the person who created it saw. And then another person will see it, and they're seeing something different again, because the question they come with is unique. It's individual. And so their perspective is individual. Yes?
I mean, all institutions have an organisational hierarchy.
Yes.
Functions. Is there someone, or is there an office within the diocese that actually looks at the organisational structure and makes recommendations and has an overview of that?
No.
Okay.
Most organisations don't really. I mean, they do for their own purposes.
Well, commercial organisations.
Yes.
Do, yeah.
Well, but what I'm saying is, when you have a moment of crisis, for instance, when the diocese had a financial crisis post-GFC, they had to look at, why did that happen? Well, it happened because of certain decisions made by high-level boards about how we're going to spend our money. And because they were investing heavily and borrowing to invest in order to build a lot, when the crash came, they couldn't meet their loan repayments, they had to sell off a lot of shares in order to pay off the loans. Not the only organisation it happened to, but it hit the Diocese of Sydney really heavily. So they look around, they go, so organisationally and administratively speaking, whose fault was it? Everyone wants to know whose fault it was. And they identified essentially that one particular board that had the management of managing the assets in that way, it was their fault. And of course there were various reasons. Perhaps they were trying to do too much that they weren't really skilled to do, and a lot of stuff's been outsourced as a result. Perhaps they didn't have the right people on the board. Essentially they just scrapped the board and got a new one. But as a result of that, they got management consultants in who came and said, well, this is why, because you're doing this, this, this and this, and you should be doing all these other things. So to answer your question about looking at administrative structures and how things are being run, yes, that does happen at that higher level, because if something's being run badly, you've got to fix that. But how that trickles down to the records that are being created at the time, it doesn't really matter in a way what you're doing. You're still creating records, documenting it, and those records will eventually come down to the archives. But record keeping, records creation and record keeping systems, as it were, exist independently of whether an organisation is well run or not, because you can be mismanaging your assets rather appallingly, but still documenting that mismanagement on a day-to-day basis. That will end up as the evidence long term. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much. But
Yeah.
yeah,
okay.
Might follow up later.
Yeah. So again, going back to what is in the collection, the diocese is essentially run by a number of boards and committees. You'll all be a bit familiar with the synod, which meets every year in triennial cycles. It's a parliament, and people, clergy and lay people go along and they have great discussions and they bash it all out. Most of the numbers and the finances and the politics has all been sorted out before in the great tradition of parliaments and large boards and committees. But it is a public forum, well, a democratic forum for the members of synod to turn up and discuss things and ask questions. The synod, of course, creates records, proceedings and financial records. The synod meets monthly as a standing committee of synod. They make decisions about policy. So they have all of their minutes and their financial records and the reports. They have lots of subcommittees as well. Go off and find out about that. So there'll be minutes and reports from all the subcommittees. So even at that level, if you were interested in knowing what did the church think about the occult in 1978 or something? Remember back in the 70s, people were very keen on the occult. They were quite worried about Ouija boards and things like that. Well, the diocese had a subcommittee of synod looking into the occult. And there was a lot of stuff on TV about it at the time. In fact, if you look at the secular world and you see what people were very interested in or very worried about, you usually find that if it's a really big ticket issue, there's a subcommittee of synod that's gone off and looked at it. Which is a handy thing to know, actually, because if you're very interested in a particular issue, it's nice to know that things were probably dealt with in a very structural way. The thing to know, I suppose, really about the Anglican Church in this diocese, anyway, I always say it's a mixture of New South Wales Parliament and Sydney University in terms of its structure and the way it thinks. Parliament, because it's very structured, we also have an awful lot of lawyers. And I think that does, you know, as members of our committees, and lawyers seem very keen on religion, I suppose. They need a respite from the rigours of their work. And I guess churches always need legal advice. But it does affect the way our business runs and the records are created, terribly legalistic. But the good thing about that is they tend to like to create records, and lawyers are very keen on evidence. And parliamentary systems are very keen on formal reports and formal minutes and evidence. So an organisation that's very structured like that tends to create a lot of records which hopefully end up in the archives. Beyond that, you've got other large entities like the Church Property Trust, which didn't start till 1882, and they're still revesting properties from the Bishop of Sydney into the property trust. It's much more efficient to have a board than lots of little individual trustees for every single block of land. And they create minutes and reports and financial records. We also had the Glebe Administration Board, which once they merged all the Glebe lands in, said, we must administer this, so let's have a board. We now have a thing called the Three Corporations, which is actually Those two corporations plus the diocesan secretariat, which is like an admin hub, you know, finance, admin, insurance, payroll staff, those leasing, that's kind of property management, but not property trust, but other kinds of property. And also, a part of the Glebe organisation is the room where they go sell, 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 buy, 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 which is part of the hub of getting us a cash flow from all our investments. So all of these head office entities are creating records every single day, and those records are eventually ending up in the Diocesan Archives. There are other agencies like Anglicare, formerly known as the Home Mission Society, grew out of the Church Society, which grew out of the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge and the Gospel. Started off just with money for books and churches and blankets for poor people, and suddenly they went, oh, I see, we've got more people who we need to help. We have Anglican Media, which used to be the Anglican Information Office. Now, of course, it's a very sophisticated, digital-based organisation, but in the early days it was just about producing magazines and newspapers. And then we have a myriad of little organisations that just don't exist anymore, like the Church of England Television Society, which was set up to produce TV programmes, you know, for evangelism. So if you look through the history of life in Sydney, and what people were doing and how they did it, you'll probably find a reflection of that in the administrative structure of the diocese, and therefore in the administrative records that are in the archives. So you kind of got this great big head office hub, like this engine room, and then you've actually got the factory floor, which is the parishes, where they're doing the work, which is ministry, which is bringing people to Christ. But they're doing it in their own particular way because the brand is Anglican. And of course, we're in a big market now. We used to be only competing with other Protestant faiths and Catholics, but now we're competing with lots of other faiths and with secularism and paganism and the notion that you don't need to have a faith as well. So the more diverse in a way that your market gets, the more focused and more active you have to be about your brand. Now, some people find it a bit shocking when I talk about, oh, it's a business and it's a brand. But if you think about it, it's not even a cynical way to look at it, I don't think. If you've got a really good product, and the evangelists in our diocese believe that their particular version of Christianity is the best one, and the one, the only one, the truth. If you've got a damn good product, then you really need to work it. And if you look around the parishes now, you'll see some very innovative ways, cafe church, rugby league church, anything to get the people in, get the children in, do what you can to attract people to your churches. Now, all of that changing world is reflected in the records that are being created every single day in a more mundane fashion in those parish offices. And what are they doing? They're just going and having more parish council meetings, church wardens' vestry meetings, the annual vestry meetings, now rebranded annual general meetings to sound more professional, churning out those financial reports, churning out those returns to head office, doing all their publications, which are probably all e-newsletters now, desktop publishing all their own pew bulletins, organising a range of social functions and fundraising events, as churches have time immemorial, but just the modern version of them. But of course now with desktop publishing they can do their own flyers, their own tickets, their own PR material, their own banners even, whereas perhaps other times they would have to outsource that and have that produced elsewhere. But desktop publishing and the digital world enables parishes to do so much more in-house and at a lower cost. So they're probably creating more records now than they ever did because they can be far more flexible about what they're doing. All of this stuff will eventually end up in the archives of the Diocese of Sydney. If you think about that, we've got 268 parishes, some with branch churches, some not. We go north to the Hawkesbury, west to Lithgow, and south just south of Nowra. There's an awful lot of people and an awful lot of parishes in that fairly small patch of land. And how many people do we have in the archives? We have me. I have enough work for 5 full-time staff. I now have a volunteer, actually. I'm very lucky. Someone many of you will have heard of, Alan Ventris, the former Director of State Records New South Wales, who, when he really had it right up to here with fighting with the state government, who were saying, do more with less and don't complain, thought, well, I don't really need to be quite so stressed every single day. I think I'll go and do something more pleasant. And he came to me and said, could I come and work for you? You clearly need more staff, and boy, it's one of the most important foundation collections in Australia. I think it would be rather interesting. So I said, yeah, sure. And he now works for me 3 days a week. He's not a trained archivist, though, so that will take time. But he's loving it, and I'm loving having him there. It's great to have someone to work with, but it's also refreshing to have to teach, to have to explain, to have to communicate that which just sits in your head and you understand it already. It's refreshing to see the perspective of the person who didn't really know anything about your organisation, possibly came with some assumptions or preconceptions, and then every now and then comes out of the repository and went, wow, I had no idea it was thus. And it reminds you that it is thus. It's this and it's not that. We will never have more staff. We're very lucky to have Alan. The budget's about 120 a year, 120,000 a year. It's me, it's the tenancy, it's the insurance and the stationery and our section of the IT budget and the electricity bill. The reason it's so low as a budget is that it's an in-house records management tool. It's there to support all of these administrators who are busily creating records in order to do the day-to-day work. Post-GFC, the Endowment of the See, which is the Archbishop's Office Division, and that's what I work in, lost 40% of its income. They then shed, within the following 6 months, this is post-November 08, 40% of outgoings and pretty much 40% of the staff. Anything that wasn't absolutely core and absolutely essential to the day-to-day of getting the work done had to go. Because, you know, you've got to balance your budget. Money in, money out. You can't live off capital reserves or loans from other sections of the organisation. You actually have to just pare yourself right down. It was a very painful time, and for all of us as staff, a time where we're going, will I have a job, essentially? Or I was thinking, well, they can't possibly just shut the archives down, but they might put me down part-time, which I'd probably have to leave then because I'd need a full-time job. We all had to write screeds of justifications as to, well, not why we should be employed, but what was it that we did and how did we use our time. And as a result of that, I'm very happy to say that the Diocesan Archives only lost 11% of its budget, that was the FAT, paper conservation. Professional development funding went out the door for a couple of years. I had to pay to go to the conferences myself. I was told not to buy anything for several years, so no more boxes, no more file folders, nothing. So you do, I mean, you just knuckle down and you just meet that requirement, because it's better that you keep the business going than you collapse. Over the next few years, my boss, the registrar, was told to find another 10% in cuts, and last year another 10. That's 60% of the overall budget that we had in, say, mid-2008. As a result, you do get a leaner, tighter sort of a machine. You do get a more focused understanding of what your business is and what it is that you're meant to be doing. But it does also put a lot of pressure on you in terms of what you can do, as opposed to what you think you'd like to do and what would be the ideal thing. The pressure has certainly been on me to focus more on the in-house work of arrangement and description of our records to improve rapid retrieval than to spend time on reference queries dealing with the general public. That's difficult because sometimes I'm the only person who can answer the question, or my answer might be, well, no, I can't help you, but instead of just, no, I can't help you, go away, it's, no, I can't help you, but this is why, and here are my suggestions as to other avenues. That can be an hour-and-a-half email. If you start doing sort of cost-benefit analysis on my time, And we did that. We figured out how much of my time was spent on non-in-house work. It turned out 60% of my time was spent dealing with non-diocesan inquiries. And my boss was always on me, you've got to get the percentage down, you've got to focus more on us, that's what we're paying for. So that's an ongoing conflict. One of the very important roles of the collection is that particularly professional researchers should be able to come, commissioned researchers, academics, PhD students, should come and use the collection to be able to interpret it and therefore publish. There's no point spending a lot of money looking after records if no one's going to use them. And they will get an in-house use, obviously, but then you get all these people with their 360 degrees of perspective who suddenly go, it's time to write the PhD on this, or the major research project. And I sit there looking at my database and think, right, in 50 years' time, people are going to want to read that body of material. Because you can just predict that they're eventually the topic will grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and maybe resolve and settle, and then eventually someone will come in and want to write about it. One thing that we're just about to do, which will make life easier for the public, is we're going to go into a third-party digitisation project with Ancestry.com. I was up at the International Congress on Archives in Brisbane a couple of years ago, listening to Alan Ventris give his paper on how State Records had entered into a third-party digitisation project with Ancestry for a lot of their very early records. It's been a controversial thing. Some people say, ooh, filthy lucre, evil commercial entities. But State Records is just down to the bone financially. I mean, they're just being starved, really, by the government that just doesn't get it, the importance of record keeping. And so they really had no choice. You either take the money from the commercial entity, which means that people will have access to these records, and they will be digitised and therefore preserved, or you don't. Well, when I listened to that paper, I thought about all the registers that are held in the Diocesan Archives that were microfilmed by the Society of Australian Genealogists under the Joint Copy Project, which has been running over 20 years now. And that's a great thing because it means people can go to a variety of locations to be able to look up this family history data for baptisms, marriages and funerals. But those microfilms are getting older, people complain about the quality of them. SAG have stopped borrowing anything from my archive to continue microfilming, so increasingly there's a body of records that aren't available by microfilm that could be in terms of closure periods. So I contacted Brad Argent from Ancestry and said, do you want the Anglican Church Diocese of Sydney? Do you fancy coming to digitise the lot? Like all these registers. And he sort of went, what do you want, in return? And I said, you probably don't have enough money for how much money I want. So how about I settle for getting all the family history inquiries off my back? Because my boss will really like that. If I was able to say that all of this stuff is available digitally, that all you have to do is be an Ancestry customer, and so many people already are, it'll become part of their existing packages. Anyone, anywhere in the world who is a fairly committed family historian would be able to get access to this stuff. But of course he loved it. And we've been negotiating and scoping on it. And I keep thinking of more bits and pieces that he could do. I mean, why just baptisms? Why not all the confirmation records? After all, it's family history data. How about the service registers that also have a lot of confirmation records in them and some baptisms and burials? Service registers aren't particularly confidential. The services themselves won't be of great interest to family historians, but all of the other data that's in there will. Ancestry are going to, and I don't know how they can afford to, individually index and add metadata to each one of these records so that you, the punter, can say, I want to buy that baptism. It's quite mind-blowing when you think about how much work will go into it. From our point of view, we just have to prepare all of the information about the registers so that we say, right, now you're going to digitise this one. They're going to bring their machinery into the office, they're going to train up Alan Ventris, and we're just going to spend months moving stuff from the repository, putting it on the machine, click, 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 back in it goes. And it will go on until we've digitized everything that I can think of that's in my collection that will be of interest to family historians and will not breach any confidentiality issues.
So might that sort of include the correspondence about those troublesome clergymen?
No, because correspondence is not family history material.
So it is, but you're
no, well I'm meaning the pure family history data, like baptism registers, confirmation returns, confirmation registers, banns registers, marriages, and burial funeral records. Strictly that core factual data, whereas a correspondence file about clergy, that would probably come under the heading of Archbishop's Office, because that's the entity, correspondence as opposed to minutes or financial records, and then the item, I suppose, might be that person's name. We have personnel files. In the modern world, of course, you have personnel files on individuals. Before we were having personnel files, files were only ever really created if you kind of popped your head up above the parapet for good or for bad in some way, and so those files would really just have that person's name. People who have done nothing other than have a normal and exemplary sort of average existence being rector of a parish may not in that earlier period have ever had a file at all, because they were just getting on with the job and being normal. In fact, a lot of those files are created towards the end of someone's life when they become sick. And so something has to be done about that. And of course, a lot of records that end up in archives are created because something happened that someone had to do something about.
Up until what date will this information be? Not to the present day?
The
ancestry
registers
is going
are, well, we have closure periods on our records to protect the privacy of the people named in. And so the current situation is that the baptism records are closed for 90 years, the marriages for 70, and burials not at all. Confirmations, we have very little requirement for them, but I think they'd probably be somewhere like in between, so 80. People are confirmed around the age of 11, 12, 13, 14. The reason we've put these on is that we have to work on the basis that we might assume that a person is deceased by the time the data goes into the public arena. Apparently, identity theft is the fastest growing international crime. Of course, with the advent of a lot of privacy legislation, the community has a fairly strong expectation now that their privacy will be protected, and a lot of forms you fill in, they say we will not use your personal records for any reason other than the reason for which they were collected. And as an individual, you have to rely upon that. Privacy legislation is not retrospective. It doesn't apply to records that were created prior to roughly 2000. However, it is incumbent on organisations to act within the spirit of the law, because that's what people expect. People aren't too fussed about whether it fitted into the legislation or not. They just don't want their personal information sold or bandied around. With the Ancestry project, they can actually just tag each individual record with metadata, and it's got a date where it opens up. So, magically at some point, the 1944 records, when their closure period is gone, they all just open up. And I'll be finding out more and more about how that actually works once we get further into the contract negotiations and have more in-depth discussions with Ancestry. At the moment, as I say, we're scoping around what kind of records, how would it work for us and how would it work for them. Oh, I should add that the sweetener for us is that they will digitise all of our in-house major minute book series for our purposes. Now, from a preservation point of view, that's just priceless. We don't have money to pay for digitisation. But once those records are digitised, we can hold those digital files in our diocesan servers as a protection against the day when the archives goes up in flames or something like that. And we would just never have the money. And in fact, I'm thinking of more and more things I'd like Ancestry to digitise for us, for our own in-house purposes. It's hopefully going to work very well for us, and it'll work very well for family historians. And it means you don't have to go physically to State Library or SAG. Yes, you do have to pay something to be an Ancestry member, but you already have to pay something to SAG. State Library's free, but we can't do everything. We are a private organisation after all. And the Archives just not your money-making department. The Royal Commission, which you touched upon. The Royal Commission is quite good for archivists and record keepers because what it's done is bring up the importance of good governance and good record keeping into the public arena. Obviously, the subject matter is distressing and shocking. But if I move beyond that and focus more on the record keeping implications, it's forced all organisations to take a far more forensic look at their processes, and particularly not only how did they manage complaints, but how did they document complaints, and how did they look after the records that documented the complaints, and how have they provided access to the records that document the complaints, and how good are they right now at producing the records that document the complaints. And one of the things I think any organisation is going to be pretty worried about is how did we do that back in 1930 or 1940s or 1950s? And the people at the top, who of course weren't there and weren't responsible for how things were set up, just have to hope like hell that their counterparts way back there in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s were on the ball and were doing it properly. We hear in the press of examples of records that have been destroyed. In some cases, I guess you don't hear the good news stories, you only hear the bad news stories because they're more sensational for the press. But I have certainly, it has impacted very greatly upon my work because the people I work for have suddenly gone, oh, how did we do things? And they can't be expected to know that. I'm really the only person in the organisation because I'm working with 1836 all the way up to about 10 years ago, all the time, every day. I'm the one who understands the administrative setup of the organisation, who did what in terms of functions, and what kinds of records were created as a result of that. And therefore, if you ask me a question like, where would you find a record that documents X or about Y, I would be able to say, well, the entity or agency that dealt with that kind of thing would be this, and these are the kinds of records they would create. So I would expect to find that record in this series, and we're looking at around about that date range, blah, blah, and I should be able to home in with the assistance of the database, obviously. But I can do most of the understanding already in my head, because that's what I'm trained to do. That's why archivists, particularly archivists who've been with your organisation quite a long time, when you're in a bad position and you really need those records, are worth their weight in gold because they can save you time. And of course, all businesses want to save time, they want to be more efficient. So I've had, in particular, my boss, the registrar, who's in charge of a lot of records to do with personnel, and also the director of the Professional Standards Unit, which is the entity that deals with all complaints of all kinds of abuse, not just to children, but also adults and any form of unethical behaviour within the parishes or other diocesan organisations. They called me and Alan up as well and said, tell us about the record-keeping systems and the record-keeping environment. How do the records work? And Alan was able to give them a very good sort of external understanding through his knowledge of government processes. I was able to tell them, well, this is how we have done it in our organisation. That meant that they were in the position to be able to say, oh, okay, these are the sorts of records we're looking for so that we can answer the questions posed by the Commission. Then it's a matter of them saying, what do you got? And me having to be somewhat creative because sometimes the descriptions aren't full at all, and knowing where I might be able to find these things. And so this is an ongoing process of me supplying records to the Professional Standards Unit and to the lawyers that they've had to engage to assist them so that they can meet the requests of the Royal Commission. And it will go on and on. And it's a very time-consuming thing, but it's very, very rewarding to actually be working at the cutting edge of what's going on in culture and society now. That it's not just people going, well, that was very interesting what we did in the 1920s, isn't that interesting? Instead, you're actually, as an archivist, able to say, I'm working with my company in order to produce the records that document how we did things then, as opposed to going, oh, well, we just haven't got anything. We actually have a lot. I can't account for what might have happened right at the top in offices a long time ago, but we're not in the business of culling and we're not in the business of sampling. Whatever comes out of the filing cabinets tends to come down to me. It is then a matter of course, a lot of time for arrangement and description, but it does mean when you've got the space, we may not have a lot of money for staff, but at the moment we have space. We've got electrically powered compactors, we've got that pre-GFC. We've got top-level air conditioning and dehumidification systems. We've got a pretty highly secure site. I've got very good IT support. And most importantly, I have very positive support from the Archbishop, from the Registrar, from the Diocesan Secretary, from the CEO. I guess that's a matter of good PR, but it's also when they want something, you jump. You always meet their expectations. It's never, oh, well, you know, maybe in a few weeks. It's like, you want it tomorrow for your 8:30 meeting, you're going to court tomorrow afternoon, you get it. And that's what they're funding it for. And that's what they really wanted for. And I guess the fact that they were willing all along from 1977, even though it wasn't a lot of money, they were still willing to put in a pretty big space right in the middle of the city and always employ a professional archivist, not a volunteer and not an untrained person, but somebody who worked within a professional code of ethics and actually seriously understood what they were doing and was professionally trained and worked within a cohort of a professional body. I think that's what's put us in a good position. It's probably accidental to some extent, but it must reflect some level of intention, as opposed to saying, no, we're just not going to spend any money on it, it's not worth it to us. I would make this comment though, that any Archbishop or Registrar who decided to start axing the archives entirely would be insane, because all their records are in there. And they're constantly needing to refer back to what was done before, particularly long before their own incumbency. Questions come up, things come up 20, 30 years later. You know, I did this in this particular parish, and this one, I gave a candle to a certain parish and I want it back, and you know, this kind of thing. Disputes and dramas go on for years, and it's a wonderful thing if I'm able to produce the file that actually has 2 or 3 pieces of paper about it. So I think that in terms of ongoing safety, shall we say, for the archives as a department, hopefully seen as a crucial in-house record-keeping, records management tool, a crucial part of the head office machinery of the Diocese of Sydney. I feel that we're relatively safe. You can't afford to be too blasé. But as I say, the Royal Commission will have focused the minds of the high-level administrators upon the need for good record-keeping and good record-keeping systems, particularly at a head office level and also at a parish level. And I think that's just going to continue. So I'm hopeful that we have a healthy future for the Diocesan Archives, and that this tremendously wide range of records will continue to be collected and used. Thank you.